Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're kicking off a new series, and we're going to start a project with the design discovery stage of the process. For this new series, we're going to be building this CRM inbox design by Alper Tornaci on Dribbble. We're going to take this design through the full process, from replicating and refining the UI in Figma, all the way through the HTML and CSS to code a fully realized prototype. I've dropped this design and a related shot into Figma for us to start with. This design looks super clean and contemporary, and also has some really fun challenges. We have a complex web app UI to plan and code, and as an added goal, we're going to tackle theming with CSS variables to achieve both light and dark variants without increasing the amount of styles needed. To get things started, we're going to go through the process of replicating and refining the design in Figma so we have complete design files to work from. Typically, you would get complete design files handed off when working in a team, or sometimes you might just have to work from a static JPEG and some assets for things like fonts, images, and colors. In our case, we'll want to recreate this design ourselves to find close Google Fonts matches for the typography, ensure all the color combinations are accessible, and plan for more of a design system approach with consistent spacing and componentization. So let's kick things off by creating an artboard for our design and getting our reference files set up. Here in Figma, I'm going to grab this reference artboard, and holding the Alt or Option key, we're going to drag out a new instance to the right and drop it underneath this recreation header here that we see. I'm going to zoom in a bit. And the first thing we want to do is figure out the artboard sizing we'll need for this original reference file. To help plan for this, I'm going to hit R for the rectangle tool, and let's drag out a rectangle that somewhat matches the dimensions of our design. Looking at the dimensions on the right here, it looks like the design is around 1600 wide and maybe something like 1290 or so high. So we can delete this temporary rectangle. While we're at it, let's drag this artboard down to follow our recreation heading. And let's call this CRM inbox. This will be the desktop size and the dark variation. I'm going to rename this layer here to be our reference. And it's good that it's locked, so that way we can't alter it right now. Let's click on our artboard layer and try out that 1600 by 1290 as a first guess for the height. We may have to unlock our reference layer temporarily here. And let's drag things into place. So now if we zoom way in, let's see if we got our dimensions right. It looks like there's no gap on the bottom right edge here. Let's spot check the top left as well. Okay, it looks like we hit that exactly, which is great. And now that our reference layer is set up in our sized artboard, let's be sure to lock down that layer so we don't accidentally move it. Now that our artboard is taken care of, let's sample all the colors used in the design and get some color styles established. As you can see right off the bat, there are some very low contrast aspects of this design that we'll definitely need to address as we refine and iterate on it. For now, we're going for a one-to-one recreation of what we find so we can finesse things from here. First, let's grab this dark gray color found in the background and sidebar. To grab this color, I'm just going to create a temporary rectangle, open up the fill color palette, and grab the color picker here. And if we sample this, I'm going to change it to hex as our color mode for now. Let's copy this. And I'm going to paste this hex value into my favorite color contrast checker called Colorable. The link to this is in the description alongside the reference design files from Dribbble, as well as the Figma design files. At this stage, I'm using Colorable just to get the HSL values from a hex code. For now, I'm just using HSL to help with the naming of these temporary color styles. And these colors that we're sampling at this stage is just to recreate our design faithfully, but we're definitely going to address the contrast ratios as we iterate on this process. And once we start addressing color contrast needs, we'll be returning back to Colorable to help ensure all combinations have sufficient contrast throughout the UI for both the dark and light UI variations. So here you can see that we have a lightness of 23. And I like to include the lightness in my color naming convention so that way you can kind of build scales that have a lot of expandability. So back in Figma, I'm going to create a color style from this hex value that we sampled. Let's create a new color style. I'm going to prefix this with the name source meaning that this came from our original reference. And that way we can differentiate between the original color styles and the ones that we'll be refining as we address the color contrast issues. So for these grays, I'm going to say that they are gunmetal is going to be the color name that we're going for. And we saw that the lightness value was 23%. So we're going to say 0 to 3 to help differentiate between the different gunmetal grays that we'll find in this design. So we'll create a style for that. And you'll see that that'll appear in our local style section in Figma. And this can be kind of a tedious process, but what I'm going to do is go through the rest of the UI and color sample each of the unique colors I find here that are part of the UI. I won't worry about imagery such as the Dribbble logo or some of these more bespoke images and icons. But as a start, we want to basically get the base palette established so we can understand the overall color approach to this design. So I'm going to speed things up here and start sampling and adding color styles, and we'll return once that's finished. All right, so we've got all of our colors sampled, as you can see in the massive amount of color styles on the right here. And you can see one of the first things that we'll need to address once we start refining this design is we simply have too many unique colors. Now, some of these might just be a result of sampling a static image versus having the original source files to work from. But what I did observe is there is a ton of unique colors throughout this design. And so to both improve maintainability and also to ensure that the color combinations found in the UI are accessible, a big part of the work that we'll do when we refine this design is to consolidate these colors down to a more refined and narrowed palette that have color contrast in mind and will be much easier to keep track of going forward. For now though, this is a good exercise because we discovered there's kind of three major UI colors found in this design. So we have these gunmetal grays that are a little bit more neutral in their saturation. Next up, I named these cool gray for now because they are similar to gunmetal, but they have noticeably more saturation throughout their scale. And then lastly, we have this electric super saturated blue. Overall, a lot of these share a very similar and very close hue, which is good for creating a really cohesive color palette. But again, we want to basically group these by their overall visual impression and then find ways to narrow down this palette to make it a lot easier to work with. Now that our colors are taken care of, let's turn our attention to finding matching Google fonts for each of the typefaces we see in our design. Looking at things, we have a typeface for the brand logo type up here in the top left, and also a main typeface for the overall UI and copy used throughout the design. Another thing I saw when I was sampling colors is the numeral, specifically this 3 found in the notifications, has some distinct characteristics. So it may be its own typeface depending on what the numbers look like in the main 2 fonts that we're picking. To kick off this process for matching the fonts, let's focus on this brand logo type here. So just looking at its properties from a first observation, it's a sans serif font. It has some personality to it, so it might be more of a humanist sans serif instead of a strict geometric sans serif. It has a pretty high X height, and we'll notice that the shape inside of the A, this enclosed space, which is called a counter in terms of typography, has a little bit of a unique kind of teardrop shape to it. The corners of the characters here have a little bit of roundness to them, which just kind of softens the feel and gives it more of a friendly personality to it. And to my eye, this font looks very close to Lotto. I don't know for sure if this font is using Lotto directly, but just as a first guess, it reminds me a lot of that Google font. So here in Google Fonts, let's narrow our selections down to just be sans serif. And we'll want to sort by popular and see if we can find any close matches for that brand logo type. I'm going to type in the brand name here and apply it to all fonts, so that way we can quickly compare these. I'm going to apply a bold weight on some of these fonts that look like a close match and see if it gets us closer to finding a nice match. So right out the gate, as I mentioned, Lotto looks an awful lot like the logo type we found in the design. We have this kind of teardrop shaped counter in the lowercase a here, and overall it has kind of that rounded friendly look to it. Let's keep going through and see if we can find any other close matches. Source Sans Pro might be a good match, but I think its shapes don't quite match up with what we're looking for. One thing I'm noticing here is the lowercase L has this little foot to it, whereas if we reference our design, it's just a straight character for the lowercase L. So a lot of font matching really relies on these unique characteristics in order to narrow the potential selection down quite a bit. Noto Sans down here looks like it might work as well. I think there's probably a little too much variance in the stroke width here, but let's check our design one last time. This is looking fairly close. We can kind of go back and forth to compare them. Okay, I think this might be a pretty good candidate. Let's get this and Lotto added. Scroll down a little bit further and see if we can find anything else that might fit in well. This Mukta Sans also is looking good. And let's maybe find one more candidate and then we can compare them directly inside of Figma. All right, I think that'll be enough font families to compare. So we'll have Mukta, Lotto, and Noto Sans. So let's grab those in Figma. We'll create a text box and type out the brand name. Let's change its fill to white and get our first typeface in place here. Change it to bold. Let's make sure our text is selected. And let's drag this down and just rough in the font size for comparison real quick. Okay, so this is our first one. Let's drag another instance down and change this to be Lotto with the bold variation. Looks like we'll have to bump down the font size a few pixels. Oh, looks like we actually are missing a character. That probably has something to do with it. So let's get these updated and change the font size accordingly. For comparison, looks like this needs to go down even further, but maybe has increased tracking overall. And let's compare this first typeface closer. That's looking like a pretty close match. Let's do one last comparison with Noto Sans. Drag that on top of our logo type, get the font size dialed in. Might be around 20 or 21 pixels. And that's all looking pretty close. Okay, so just comparing these three options here, which one seems to capture the personality best? One thing I'm seeing is the shape of this A has a little bit more stroke variation than what we're seeing with Lotto, so we can cut that option out. Next up, let's compare between Noto Sans and Mukta. Now these are all very close matches, but looking at the foot of this A, it looks like it has a little bit of a narrower shape down at the bottom here. Another thing with the D is it looks like it's a little bit narrower in its width. So I think I'm leaning towards Noto Sans as our best match. So we'll go with this. So the way we're going to likely handle this typeface specifically for use in the logo is probably vectorize it and export it as an SVG. And that way we don't have to load a dedicated font file just for this one word in our UI. So let's overlay this on top of our design real quick, just to compare it as a match. That's looking good. Maybe we want to tuck in the letter spacing just a tad, and that's looking like a pretty dead-on match there. Next up, let's turn our attention to this typeface that we see throughout our UI. So for these headings at various scales, a lot of the links and body copy that we see here. And one thing I'm observing from a high level is that this is much more of a geometric sans serif. So it has very geometric shapes, like a perfect circle for the O, and overall it has a relatively large X height, which helps with legibility in the typeface. A couple unique features of this that we can look out for in Google Fonts is that the lowercase a is what's known as a single story character. And that basically means that it only has one counter without that stem coming across the top like we saw with the typeface used in our logo. Another thing I'm noticing is that this lowercase s has shoulders or terminals. I'm not really sure what to call them. You can see that basically these extensions of the s go down quite a long ways instead of terminating somewhere higher up on the top or bottom. So with these properties in mind, some of these unique characteristics, let's turn our attention back to Google Fonts to find a close match. So we can get rid of these selections that were acting as a temporary placeholder for now. We'll still want sans serif. We probably want to filter by number of styles to make sure there's at least 2 or 3 weights with this typeface, because we know we need to use it in different contexts throughout the UI. And let's match that dashboard word because that had some of the unique characteristics of the typeface. And for these, we'll probably want a regular or light font weight to look at. And right out the gate, we can eliminate a ton of options just based on that unique A and S shape. So scrolling down, the first typeface I'm spotting with some of those characteristics would be Poppins. So let's get that added to our potential candidates. Mooley looks good overall, but the O isn't quite as geometric. It's not a perfect circle as what we're looking for. So let's continue on. Quicksand has relatively close shapes, but you can see that's a little too rounded with the actual strokes having a rounded cap. Let's see if there's any other good candidates nearby here. Just continuing on, very quickly eliminating anything that doesn't have those characteristic A and S shapes. Looks like Montserrat Alternatives has some of those characteristics and quite a number of styles. We can take a look at that. And won't go too much further into these because we're getting into less popular typefaces. So I like to stick with a little bit more vetted options when working with these in projects. Yep, and that looks like that's actually the end of our results here. With these 2 families selected, we have Poppins and Montserrat alternates. Let's go back into Figma and compare these with this dashboard link. So we'll drag out some text, type out dashboard. We'll select Poppins as our first option. This will probably be a regular or lightweight font. Let's make sure that it's white so we can see what we're doing here. And reducing the font size as needed. Let's get it to match our design roughly here. And make sure we don't have any letter spacing applied by default. So we can probably bump this down by another pixel. Overall, it's looking like a pretty close match for Poppins. Let's drag out another instance and select that Montserrat, and this will be the alternates. Now that we see these in context, one thing I'm seeing right away is this S for Montserrat alternates doesn't seem to have that same extension that wraps around like Poppins does. So I think that'll narrow it down to Poppins as our best candidate for this replacement typeface. So overlaying this on top, let's just do one more quick check. Overall, I think we're capturing the correct feel and look of this typeface that's found in the original design. So I think this is probably something we can stick with. We might want to bump up the letter spacing by a percentage point or so just to match the design initially. And one other consideration of this UI typeface is to look at its numerals because we do have this really stylized 3. So let's drag this out and see what the 3 looks like. You can see it's much more rounded if we were to type out some of the numerals found in this typeface. Overall, they're much more rounded. That sharp corner on the 3 that we were hoping for. The 2 looks pretty similar with that sharp corner on the bottom left. And let's see if we have any other comparison points. The 5 looks pretty standard overall. The 1 has this little foot or stem on it that matches Poppins decently well, but it's probably not a perfect match in terms of the numerals for this typeface. Overall though, I think we could hunt for a dedicated typeface that has these numerals, but we'd have to load, again, dedicated font files just for a couple numbers in the UI. For simplicity, in terms of this series, I think we're going to stick with pop-ins throughout all instances in the UI, and that way we can optimize for performance and maintainability. So let's get rid of those temporary numerals typed out there. And I think the next step here is we're going to want to go throughout the remaining UI here and start matching typography throughout the design. What we're going to do is similar to the color styles. We're basically going to match typography exactly with what we find and establish type specs with a name that starts with source. And that way we can tell that it came from this original design. And since we don't really know all of the use cases for the typography until we've done this exercise, I think we'll just name it with the font size in the name. And then we might have more semantic names for different type specs once we really understand how they'll be used. So similar to the sampling of color styles, I'm going to speed things up here and get all of our typography matched throughout this design and check in once that's complete. All right, so what I've done is I've gone through and replicated all of the type specs that I found uniquely in this design. If we look at our text styles here on the right, luckily it looks like we don't have too many distinct font sizes nor weights. It looks like we're using regular and medium for this Poppins font that we chose, and there's not too many distinct font sizes along that scale. That being said, we may want to converge some of these because there's only a 1 pixel difference between them. We still have to refine line heights as well once we address kind of edge cases that we'll find. But you can see here on the left in my layers panel, we're starting to get an idea of the various components or large level layouts that we'll find in our design. So I think that'll wrap it up for this episode. Right now you can see that things aren't aligning perfectly in our design, but we'll get that refined once we start building things out on a component level. Be sure to check out the next episode. We'll start establishing the overall layout, addressing things component by component, and get the overall visual presentation of this UI tackled.